Hi, I'm Carl Weber. This is the third video in my series about becoming a successful business book author. I've been part of the business publishing world for decades. I was an editor and publisher at some of the top houses in the industry, and as a freelancer I've worked for years as a writer, editor, collaborator, and consultant with many authors. I've been lucky enough to work with some of the best business authors of our time, helping them create successful books about many varied topics: management and strategy, finance and investing, leadership and communications, personal development and career growth, and much more. In the first video in this series, I explained 6 reasons why you might want to consider becoming a business book author. In the second video, I suggested 5 questions you can use to help you discover the great business book that may be hidden inside you, waiting to come out. Now I want to discuss one of the most important tools you need to master if you want to write a book that lots of people will buy, read, and love. That tool is the power of story. And to illustrate what I mean, let me start by telling you a story. This man is Muhammad Yunus. You may have heard of him, but if you haven't, let me tell you a little about him. He was born and raised in Bangladesh, a small, very poor country nestled between the Asian giants of India and China. As a young man, he came to the United States to study economics. Eventually, Yunus went back home to Bangladesh to become a professor. He was living the life of a typical college teacher when disaster struck his homeland, a terrible famine that claimed the lives of millions of people in this country that already had very high rates of poverty. Yunus was horrified by the suffering he saw around him. Being an economics professor, Yunus was driven to investigate the causes of the devastating poverty in Bangladesh. He and his students spent time visiting with poor people in the nearby village of Jobra. They found that these people worked very hard, trying to make money through farming and craft work, for example, making and selling clothing, stools, and baskets. But no matter how hard the people worked, they couldn't seem to work their way out of poverty. Why? Yunus and the students asked more questions, and gradually the answer emerged. It turned out that most of the people in this tiny village were in debt to a moneylender. When they needed cash to buy basic supplies for their work, for example, cloth for making saris or wood to make furniture, the moneylender was the only source. And once they borrowed from him, they had to repay him at interest rates he chose, often as much as 10% per week. That meant it was almost impossible for them to pay off their debts. The people of Jobra became virtual slaves, working day and night with no hope of ever escaping poverty, all because they had no source of capital other than the moneylender. No bank would lend them money because they were illiterate and extremely poor. They couldn't even fill out the paperwork to apply for a loan or a credit card. Yunus wanted desperately to help these poor people find a way out of their plight. Unable to think of a solution, he eventually had his students survey the people of the village to find out how much money they owed the moneylender. They found that 42 people owed the moneylender a total of 856 taka, the equivalent of about $27. Stunned, Yunus did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his own pocket and gave the villagers the money to pay off the moneylender. He told them, "Pay me back whenever you get a chance." They had been freed from slavery and were finally able to work their way out of poverty. They did, and they all paid Yunus back every cent. This was the start of a new life's work for Muhammad Yunus. He founded Grameen Bank, which developed what is now known as microcredit, a system of lending small amounts of money to help poor people start and grow businesses. Over the last 30 years, microcredit has spread around the world. It now helps 150 million families in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and it won Professor Yunus the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. I've worked with Professor Yunus on 2 books explaining his ideas about fighting poverty. He begins every speech by telling the story of how microcredit was born, just the way I recounted it to you. Now, why have I taken the time to share this story with you? It's an interesting story that I hope you found inspiring, but notice all the things this story communicates to anyone who hears it. First, it explains the concept of microcredit in very simple, understandable fashion. It's about lending small amounts of money to very poor people who need it desperately. Second, in so doing, the story shows how a familiar financial activity, banking, can be practiced not just to earn profits, but to help people in need, a new and potentially revolutionary way to think about business. Third, the story defines microcredit without economic jargon, sociological language, or financial terms. It gives the abstract idea a human face. Fourth, it helps you understand the kind of person Professor Yunus is, an economics professor who combines a compassionate heart with a practical approach to problems, seeking simple, straightforward solutions. And finally, the story also teaches you some truths about poverty that you might not have realized, that poor people in the developing world work very hard, that they have a strong desire to escape from poverty, and that the main culprit that traps them in poverty is systems beyond their control. The story accomplishes all these things while at the same time it captures your interest and makes you curious to learn more. How did Yunus turn his simple personal gesture into a bank serving millions of people? How did the idea of microcredit spread to many countries? What impact has microcredit had on poverty around the world, and what more can be done? It's no accident that most of the great communicators have used stories to convey their ideas. Leaders like Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Martin Luther King told stories to inspire people and change their thinking. Abe Lincoln used homespun yarns to explain the evils of slavery and the importance of saving the Union. Even the biblical parables of Jesus show the power of stories to win hearts. The best business books also use great stories. Glance at books by popular business writers like Malcolm Gladwell, Stephen Covey, Chip and Dan Heath, Michael Lewis, or Jim Collins, and you'll find they all have one thing in common. What all these authors share is not necessarily profound ideas, unique insights, fascinating research, or convincing arguments, though all of these things are useful. What they all have in common is well-chosen, well-told stories that make strong connections with readers. So the single best piece of advice I can give to any aspiring author in business or in any field of interest is this. Once you've defined the message you want to convey in your book, the next step should be to begin to search for a few great stories that will capture your message for readers. Stories may be drawn from your personal experience, like Muhammad Yunus's story. They may be drawn from the lives of people you've known or worked with or interviewed. They may come from history or from the daily news. The source isn't important. What matters is that the stories capture what's important and interesting about your message and do so in a vivid way. Of course, coming up with great stories to tell is only part of the process of creating a successful business book. You can learn much more about the ingredients of great business books by attending the Business Writers Conference hosted by my friends Jack and Patty Phillips at the Business Writers Network. I'll be one of the featured speakers at this year's conference, along with some of the smartest and most interesting people from the world of business publishing: writers, editors, publishers, publicists, consultants, agents, and others. And I'd love to meet you there. Thanks for watching. For more information about the second annual Business Writers Conference, April 19th to 21st, 2017, visit www.business-writers-exchange.com.